Thanks everyone for being here. We have some wonderful panelists. So we're going to go down, and we're just going to start off by letting everyone introduce themselves, and then by way of introduction, we're going to have everyone talk about a way that they're using AI and machine learning in their business or personally, or however they prefer to talk about it. Because just I think it's important to get some background, and then we'll get into the spicy stuff. So take it away.
Hi, I'm Jessica. I do a lot of the AI work at Ogilvy. We do a combination of work for our end clients, kind of as a consultancy and occasionally building different platform pieces for them. We also do a fair amount of internal work. Usually that is focused around analyzing brands and how they interact with their end consumers, and then kind of advising them long term over how they should adjust their communications to better align with different consumer groups.
I'm Beth. I run the data science side of the search and data science team at Publicis North America. We use data science and AI and machine learning a lot in understanding consumer insights and how that relates to brands, and how brands can sort of better understand their consumers through what we're getting in metadata that the consumer is putting forward.
Hi, I'm Erin, Rech. I head up digital ad initiative. We're one of the media companies. We have clients like Amazon and Dr. Pepper and Merck. And we spend a lot of time in the AI and computer vision space trying to match those like moments for brands to the right consumer, right place, right time, right message.
Hey everyone, I'm Ophir, Tanz, founder, CEO of GumGum. So everything we do is an expression of computer vision as it relates to advertising or sports sponsorship valuation or social media analysis. We have a healthcare division that is focused on various sort of exciting opportunities there. And just some background, as we're not probably as well known as these guys. We're about 300 people, headquartered in Los Angeles, and really squarely focused on computer vision, even before it was sort of the hip thing to do.
So there's like few technologies that have been hyped as much as AI. You've got Common on TV, primetime, talking about AI on like an empty stage like this one. So what has realistically changed in the last 5 years or 6 years since AI has really entered the public mind? Like, have we lived up to the hype? What has changed in the day-to-day versus maybe what we used to call statistics 5 years ago? Open to anybody.
I think a big piece of it is that brands want AI now. I don't know that they always know what that means, but it's the new hip thing. They want to be the brand that's cutting edge, and so they want some sort of offering to put out there that says that they're on the cutting edge.
There's also technologies that exist that we can leverage now, right? It used to just be, AI, the buzzword, but now there's actually platforms like Watson, our own data stack that help us see into that. So it's a little bit more real. How often it's used is not probably what we would expect, but it's actually something you can activate on.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything has changed in the past 5 years, and that like a lot of these technologies didn't really exist anywhere. So those are the capabilities that you're able to achieve today with neural networks were really in their nascency like 5 years ago. This stuff goes back to the 50s and 60s, but really it's gotten to a point where it's really good enough to have a meaningful impact on the world today, but it's still completely nascent. And there's a huge amount of artistry associated with making things work. And like one thing we talk about at GumGum is like we don't actually know how well something's going to work until you actually try it out, is the truth. And like nobody wants to talk about that. But the reality is it's like full of things that are more like bugs than features. And there's certain things that certain like IBM commercials might make you think are possible today, but are just not yet possible. But we're certainly getting to a point, and this technology is certainly at a point where you can certainly do some things that were never before possible, and certainly do a lot of things 10x better. But again, I think it's like the question is, where are we going to be in 5 years from now? I think it'll be much more interesting.
So when a client comes to you or a partner comes to you and they say, we want to be that cutting edge company that uses AI, I mean, what do you tell them? I mean, because there's this idea that's like, okay, great, like we've got, I mean, not to pick on IBM, but we've got the little, spinning Watson logo on the table, and it's going to tell us everything that we need to do. How do you not overpromise, but realistically tell someone that, okay, the AI is going to crunch your metadata, and like, how do you make that like sexy to vibe with what they actually want?
Well, I think step one is actually to be realistic about what the technology is actually capable of and how it can best assist a particular brand. Because a lot of the brands are super excited to hop on the wagon, but they don't even know what that means. So it's kind of creating a plan for them and going, what data do you have? What will you actually do with it, right? And then the AI can help with that bridge.
I found that a lot of our clients come to us and they want something, but they don't necessarily have data to give us, or they don't know exactly what they want. So what we've done at Publicis is sort of productize different capabilities so that we can say, here are the 12 different things we could do for you. Does this answer any of your specific brand questions? And then we have use cases that can sort of sell it through, because we're creating on the spot in a lot of cases, which is fun and exciting, but it's hard to sell that through to a brand who just wants the answer now.
Well, I think there's another piece to that, because most agencies are pretty similar, so I agree with you. But I think there's also that like reserve of what I call like my matchmaking skills, which is I'm constantly on the lookout for some of these partners like a GumGum, where we can activate quickly when we get that call for do something shiny, right? Because they don't really understand what they're asking, and you want to try to deliver, because if they have the appetite, you don't want that to go south, right? So it's thinking about like, okay, who's in my arsenal to quickly go to with like, what are my few things that I'm excited about right now? And that tends to help.
Thank you. So I would say one thing that's really nice about computer vision versus other forms of AI is that it's just it's visual, right? And you can actually watch it in real time and see if it works and if it doesn't. So I think that with that particular form of AI, it's the value proposition is much more sort of provably clear in the moment. Whereas if you're dealing with something like predictive analytics or there's other stuff like that, it's just obviously much more involved in terms of what the actual value proposition is relative, especially to other types of statistical methods that are not AI driven, but still, very effective, maybe just as effective.
Right. And so what's overhyped? What do you see and you're like, that's BS, and these people are overpromising and they're never going to get what they want?
I mean, I think we've all already discussed that we think everything is overhyped. There are a lot of promising things that I think over the next 5 years could be really amazing. For myself, I find speech to text and vice versa one of the worst things, just because there's so many dialects and whatnot. But that doesn't mean that it is an area that can't expand greatly and has a lot of value.
Blockchain, I'm over it for media. Like, everyone calm down. Maybe there's some like things we can learn from it, and the fact that people want more transparency and they want a general ledger, but like, does that mean that blockchain plus media is going to be successful? No.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do. This is an amazing technology, right? And it is enabling. But I think, ultimately, there aren't that many companies that are that large that are actually operating off the backs of pure AI in a way that is super common. Yet I think that's what we're going to see over the next 7 to 10 years, is that will come to pass. I think GumGum is a company that literally we wouldn't exist without this technology, and that it literally is at the core of everything that we do, and that if it didn't exist, we couldn't do the things that we do. Like, the value proposition is literally baked into the AI component. But I would agree that the amount of overhyping is very prevalent, but it's also not surprising. Everything is overhyped. That's the hype cycle, right? You have every new technology that gets overhyped, and then sort of there's this period where everyone is kind of bummed out about it, and then it quietly actually comes to fulfill our wishes. And I think that's happening now in VR, where several years ago it got overhyped, and I think now we're about to see it really take off in a meaningful mainstream way.
So something that's like a bummer about AI right now is the idea of bias. and that people are starting to realize that our AI systems pick up human bias, whether that's in text, whether it's facial recognition, not being able to recognize people of color in an accurate way. So when brands want to use AI, what's the knowledge that they have about bias, and what are you guys doing to safeguard against bias, and how do you even think about this in something where, especially in this era of like brand safety?
Yeah, I think bias is a huge issue, especially when you're doing machine learning. You're trying to train a data set using data that you've gotten from specific sources, and the sources are inherently biased. Like any sort of long form text and reviews, you have a certain type of person who writes reviews, and you're not getting the full breadth of opinion. So I think one of the things we try to do is just be pretty honest about that you are getting sort of these biases in the data, and find different sources that maybe can combat some of that bias that you're getting in specific sources. But I think it's just kind of part of the game, and being transparent about it with your clients is very important.
Well, and I think too, just with the bias piece for a brand specifically, you have to look for the data sets that will be bias free, right? So if we're targeting more of like a moment rather than a human, that will take some of the bias out of it, right? If we're trying to target every moment someone's in a movie theater, that's less biased than if we're trying to target a specific gender, let's say, right? So I think it's trying to be judicious about those decisions, especially in culture right now, right? It's a huge topic. We have to be responsible for it, and trying to find those more neutral data sets is a way in.
Yeah, I mean, so I was going to say, I mean, bias is a huge issue, because in machine learning, you're effectively feeding data through this process that the output is a function of the data. It's almost impossible to find truly unbiased data, right? Like, so for example, there's so many examples of it, but like we do assault rifle recognition. We do all types of nudity detection, swastika, weapons detection to protect brands and put them in safe environments. And one thing we noticed with our assault weapons recognition is that we were also just identifying camouflage, because a lot of that data that we were inputting sort of was people in sort of camo, and that was then being associated with that label. And we just see it across the board. So I think the fundamental assumption needs to be that everything is biased, and that your job is to sort of clean it up. And I think that you have to be operating off of that assumption regardless of sort of the implementation of a given machine learning model.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest risks is that as humans, we're all biased. And it's very difficult as a trainer to even step away from your own cultural biases to go, I am being biased about this topic, right? And there's a great deal of value in having a broad team that can actually try to catch some of that. Because yes, whatever social input that you're doing is going to be biased because people have extreme views. But how do you catch it even in cases like that, where is there value in trying to make sure that you have a set of images that don't just have camo and things like that? And it's very tricky. And I don't know that I've seen any company or group of people that have managed to get beyond that yet, because we're all human, for better or worse.
But whose job is it to look out for bias? I mean, in an ideal world, it's everyone. But I mean, I could imagine that when something is so data dependent, like AI, and maybe the brand or the partner is only capturing a certain amount of data that doesn't have a wide enough field of view, is it? I guess, do you say, okay, you need to fundamentally change the way you do your business or the way you capture data to get something unbiased so we can even do that AI? Are brands like willing to change to any extent to actually combat this problem? What have your experiences been in this?
I mean, I would almost argue that it's the data scientist's role to help do that. Most of what we're analyzing for brands is not coming so much from the brand itself as it is from society at large. And I don't know that a brand should be filtering that beyond acknowledging that there are biases within it. I think it gets kind of strange if you go, I only want to listen to people that talk a certain way. But that's a larger issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's me and my team. It's our duty to understand the biases and understand also the cultural aspects. If we are working with a global client, I don't always know exactly what I'm interpreting because I don't have that same mindset. So we try to work with other teams globally to sort of validate if we are interpreting things correctly.
Yeah, I mean, and that's also an idea of bias, is that a lot of the data right now is very U.S. centric. What would you recommend for a company or a brand that doesn't have access to, maybe a global data set or a global set of partners?
I think it's just if you don't have access to people on the ground in those countries, I think it's doing the appropriate research into how different cultures think about certain things. There's a ton of academic research out there about the differences between masculinity in the UK versus the US versus Mexico. So sort of knowing what you're trying to answer and then understanding the inherent biases that are just there, period.
I mean, you could also argue that like the players that win the game are the ones that are most proficient at getting good representative data. Like if you're, like ultimately, I think that the most defensible component of AI today, given the way that we sort of put it into use, is data, which is why companies that have really rich historic data sets are in a good position. But if you're talking about going after new opportunities where, say two companies are competing and they don't have some legacy sort of data set, then the precision, the recall, and the ultimate accuracy of that model is going to be a function of who is better at getting data. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things you could do algorithmically, and that shouldn't be sort of completely diminished, but that is like a big part of the game, right?
Yeah. And so when you guys are seeing AI news in general, so you see something like Google Duplex, the AI that Google debuted that can make a phone call and either book a reservation for a hair salon or a restaurant. And that's one of those hype-generating things that everybody wants. How do you determine what is actually useful for you and what might be something that you would pass on because it's not ready yet?
Well, I think from our point of view, as far as a media agency would go, we're looking at the cost-benefit analysis of it, right? So is there a benefit to jumping on early and often because we'll get some sort of brand lift because of the buzz attached to it? Or is it that the barrier of trying to keep pace will bury us anyway and we won't be able to launch in time, right? So it's sort of that, like, is it worth the investment? Can we go fast enough? At least from our point of view, because we're controlling those dollars in the marketplace.
Is the speed of like AI research typically that fast, where you see something and you can iterate on it?
I mean, even Alexa, right? I mean, they've sort of closed off building out skills, and that was a quick window. Before brands could even understand how to use it, how to even drive you from the Alexa device into an e-commerce platform on Amazon, or to even just get you to be aware of the brand. And now they're tightening that, right? So now it's thinking more about how are you optimizing your search platforms and the ways that they're scraping the data instead, which is way less sexy in the news. But that's the problem, is it does move pretty quickly, and these brands are big. They can't move as fast.
Yeah, I just think the adoption isn't there quick enough from our client side to warrant necessarily the initial investment until it is something that's actually viable for a brand and solves problems, isn't just a cool thing they can say they can do.
Yeah, there's so many startups that keep popping up. I know I'm constantly on the lookout for new things that we might be able to leverage for our clients. But kind of to everyone's point, that might be 6 months down the line, and you're constantly having to like reassess, like, is the API still doing what it was supposed to? Is the cost benefit there? Because there's a lot of hidden gotchas with just hosting costs, things like that the news doesn't cover.
So there seems to be this, I guess, dichotomous relationship in AI between like the big companies like your Amazons, your Googles, your Microsofts, and the startups that are always promising something new. So, but a lot of the power does rest with a Google and Amazon. The companies that are selling APIs, that are really doing a lot of the fundamental research. Is that a problem that so much power in AI is consolidated kind of at the top between 4 or 5 companies, or is it something where there's enough, I guess, diversity in terms of like open source frameworks and things like that? How do you view?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. AI in many ways is inherently winner take all. Those are just the dynamics at play. That's partially why it's a very sexy sort of business opportunity, but it's also why there's a lot of fear around it. I think it is very legitimate. One of the interesting things I think to know, or 2 interesting points that are sort of non-obvious, is that I think that the platforms that exist, if you're trying to solve real sort of problems with AI, are not the mechanism by which they have been solved to date, and not the mechanism by which they're going to be solved for the most part, say over the next 7 years. A platform opportunity is only really useful when something's become properly commoditized. So if you're talking about translation services or voice to text or something like that, it's commoditized enough that you can sort of pick that out and throw it in your app and have no expertise, and you have like AI operating. But I think, as somebody who's sort of operating in this category, we have a lot of PhD level folks at GumGum that are capable of fundamental research and moving the ball forward, and we do some publishing around that, but not a huge amount. And the reason is because we have a pipeline of problems we're trying to solve that is 2 years long, right? But what we've come to realize also is that the low-level task improvements, low-level algorithmic improvements, tend to get commoditized very quickly. That's where you're seeing a lot of commoditization, is that any new development, a paper gets written, it's put out in the open source environments like very, very quickly. So the competitive advantage in that regard is actually very low. So far, I think, companies like Google and Amazon are doing a lot of fundamental research. They are pushing them all forward, and a lot of that stuff is making it to the open source. It does become scary if some of that stops happening with the velocity at which it has been happening. And certainly they have that power. I don't think they'd be opposed to wielding it if they felt that was the right decision for them. So, yeah, and we should be probably afraid.
We should be probably afraid. That's a pretty good slogan for how we talk about AI today. But you bring up an interesting point. Like, one of the things about Google Duplex, especially, was almost every other big AI announcement that I've seen Google make, they have put a paper out beforehand. So like their auto ML thing, where you have an algorithm that evolves. They had published on that, a few months before, and right now there's nothing on Google Duplex besides a kind of PR filtered blog post. So it makes you wonder, like, whether the future sight that you can kind of get into these products is starting to wave.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, once they have to have a competitive advantage at some point, and they need to have a business, right? That's what they're trying to accomplish. So I think that's a great point. I think when they recognize that there's some compelling opportunity that is really disruptive, that could be a multi-billion-dollar or much larger business, then they're going to keep that to themselves. And I think on some level that's okay. They're a company. They're not a charity. But it's a good example of what might continue to occur as the stuff gets more competitive, and as you really find product market fit and actual viable opportunities that aren't just fundamental research, right?
Right, and I think there's a difference between what the brands that would invest in those things pay attention to versus what probably everyone in this room would pay attention to, right? So the brands don't really care about those white papers in the way that they're dependent on the technology. They want to figure out how, once that thing is viable, how to leverage it to reach their consumers, right, or their targets. So it's a little less high stakes in that case. And yes, forecasting against where Google and Amazon are going is very important for all of our clients, but they can wait a little bit longer than trying to read the tea leaves.
I also think that this is maybe something Google should keep to themselves, because from a brand side, customer service is always a huge pain point for any brand. And to have a technology that can handle that at scale for brands, it could be huge and game-changing. So it might be something that they don't want to share in an open source way.
It also, does go to show how tone deaf Silicon Valley is, and I feel like I'm in this chamber as well. And because it is such a cool technology, it's so convincing. from a technology perspective, it's such an achievement. But you have this massive organization that's obviously global and the biggest company in the world, and they don't realize like that they should caveat it with, we know this is a little creepy or something. No, just anything, nothing, right? Like, which I think they've gotten a lot of flack for, obviously, over the past few weeks.
And so is this something where people see Google doing this, and maybe the pipeline is being shut off, but is this something where brands are thinking, okay, whenever Google releases this, we'll just hop on the bandwagon, or do people think, okay, we need to hire PhDs and be able to do this ourselves?
From an agency perspective, I think we will hop on the bandwagon. It's one of those, why would we sort of invest when someone's done it and probably can do it better, and the cost will be similar.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I was going to say, part of why a lot of the brands come to us, I think, is because they don't want to make the investment internally. And they go, if you guys have already done a bunch of the research, you know what works. They're really all about efficiency, both in cost and time, because, as we've discussed, everyone wants everything yesterday, which is probably why we will hop on said bandwagon. But I do think that a lot of the real innovation in the industry has come from startups. And part of where Google and Amazon have gotten a leg up is that they've bought a lot of them and then started integrating them. And then are using their hosting platforms as an additional offering to go, you really want to come and give us everything, which is where I think the risk is.
But I think this is actually a really interesting topic to me, because AI is fundamentally different than kind of like any other product in this way, where what you're scaling up isn't necessarily something that is. What you're scaling up is something, a human replacement. So it's labor automation in a way. And the way that labor is done is really, really important. So if you're hopping on the bandwagon and you're trusting Google to handle all these customers, it's super high stakes. And it's a technology that, like we've said, has been biased and maybe doesn't understand every single person in the room. So especially in this era of like brand safety, if we see Google's AI coming out with something like Microsoft's Tay did, where it became racist and talking about Nazis in 24 hours, that could be like an entire activation or entire thing that just gets nuked because some of this like really critical technology was out of your control. So to what extent do we trust Google? Is it something that's going to be always implicit?
It varies by brand, but I think in general we look to Google and other third parties to help with that, because I think when you're building something that is beyond remote and or human control, you are taking on that risk. For example, like when we're working within YouTube, we deploy OpenSlate, which helps us make sure that we're using brand safe and running against brand safe content. But it's also a delay. It's not an automatic block forward. So I would be looking to Google to say like, okay, great. What's your OpenSlate source for this AI? How are we protecting ourselves? We want to go on this ride with you, but there's risk there.
Do brands want, or any partners or clients want any kind of, I guess, a guarantee is never really something that you can give, but like that this AI is either going to work as promised, is unbiased, what are there any like best practices or standards?
I think there's one point about why questions like this are difficult is because it's like, what do you think about, will AI do this? And it's really just like, it's a tool, and it's a powerful tool, but it's also not like this thing. It's like you're trying, I think what these ladies are trying to do, and we work with agencies every day, is like they have a certain skill set. They're trying to achieve certain outcomes on behalf of their clients. And they're looking at a massive set of tools and a lot of noise and trying to pick through it and identify like which ones will actually help them achieve a given goal. And I'm not knocking your questions. I think your questions are very good. I'm just saying that the nature of the question is difficult because it's such a general question, but really in practice it's so specific. Yeah. And the applications vary so widely in terms of what you're trying to accomplish that I think it's just a little difficult to answer. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, yes, everyone wants the safe answer, and they never want to have a, oops, that just happened to my brand. But the most that you can really do is try to be familiar with the tools that you're leveraging and try to build in safety blocks so you're not entirely dependent on an AI to catch things. I mean, you do this as regular programming, right? You have error states. You have to do the same thing where possible when a system like that is being involved, to be like, we need to yank this, or there's a caveat, or things like that, and just acknowledge that there's going to be a certain range where it is in some way a living organism that is not completely controllable.
Well, and anyone who's written code, that that's true, right? But is that who the end user is who's buying the media or the technology off of you, right? They don't know that that risk is 100% included in everything you touch within the digital programming and AI landscape, right? So we know that.
Right. I'd also say one more thing, which is that like what Google and Amazon, what they're trying to do, everything is platform oriented. And I think you're just going to see startups like eating their lunch every single day. To the extent that we compete, we love competing directly with them with certain types of applications because they just can't support the customers nearly as much because they're trying to do these very specific things in a highly generalized way. So like maybe they continue to acquire everyone, and it's possible they're rich enough almost. But I do think that the amount of opportunity available for startups that are focused on solving problems in a vertical fashion is massive. So while these companies deserve a lot of credit and a lot of attention, I also think that a lot of the actual problems that are going to be solved fundamentally with AI as its core value are going to come out of startups over this next period.
Great. So I think we're going to take some questions from the crowd. If anybody has a question, we have some microphones circulating. Seeing a... Oh.
When you're working with corporations, do they want the AI that you are doing to interface with AI projects that might not be interfacing with the marketing, but other departments within their company?
I would say most of the time, yes. One of the challenges for my team is that we're all often, even though we might have tried to build pre-done things, clients always have unique issues, and they'll come and say, we have this problem over here. It's a system you've never seen before. Maybe it's custom. We want you to integrate it, figure out how to solve our issue for us, and tie in either our existing components or something new.
And I think those are some of the most exciting pieces of work, is when you get to really get into someone's business and understand what they're doing and how you can help make it even more exciting.
Hi, my name is Sarah Fay. I'm with Glasswing Ventures. I'd love to hear the panelists go down the line and give their assessment of, on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is the lowest and 10 is the highest, what is the state of readiness from a data standpoint of your clients?
For what in particular?
For implementing AI data-oriented solutions.
I would say it varies wildly. I would say in general, probably around a 4. And a huge part of what we do when we get brought on is try to do an education process about, if this is what you want, this is what we need you to help us with. We can only bring but so much to the table. And a lot of them just being unfamiliar with the space, until that conversation happens, they really have no idea of what they would even bring to the table, other than potentially, we have call center recordings, or we have logs of things that have happened and what people have bought over the years. I've had some of them come and say, we don't even have a unified view of each individual customer that we have. And then step 1 is, okay, so how do we get that so we can take it to the next level?
Yeah, I might almost go lower and say 3. I think they're a lot of times looking for us to help provide a lot of that data readiness, and the things they do have, they're not complete data sets. They're not usually things that my team can really work with. But again, it's a fun part of the challenge.
Well, I think it's hard to give one average because they all are in such different states based on their businesses too. If they're a soda, they rely on other channels to distribute and sell their products. So they don't have actual customer data. If they're an actual e-commerce brand, then that's different, right? So we have 1s, we have 5s, we have 6s as far as it goes, but we're anywhere on that spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I would entirely agree with Erin, which is that it's basically like it's anywhere between 1 and 10, but it's entirely based on luck. It's like, does that happen to be structured data that you can feed in? Like, oh, that's a 10, but like a lot of times it needs a lot of work, so it's lower. I don't think there's a lot of things intentionally happening generally that are trying to increase the state of readiness. Until there's a use case, they're just not either investing in that effort or just not aware of what they should be doing anyway. Like, they might be willing to do it, but aren't educated about what to do.
Great. Anything else? Oh, yep, one here.
I was just wondering, for anyone coming right out of school or maybe changing careers, would you recommend, if they really want to get in the front, I know this is super broad, ahead of the curve with AI and how it's developing, would you recommend they look into a smaller company like a startup or a larger company with global resources? Just curious what your thoughts are.
I would recommend a smaller company, actually. I think that if you're coming out and you have that passion and you really want to get in the weeds of it, the smaller the company, just the more the opportunities, usually because there's less people that know how to do what you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think with a large company, you're getting sort of good training. You're around a lot of smart people. It's a high quality experience, learning experience. You might, if you end up at the right startup that's really well structured and well organized and not sort of fighting for survival every day on the brink of dying, then you might like get a great experience there. But I think that risk, that reward comes with risk, and that you might end up in like a crappy environment that's just not a very good. I mean, there's just so many unknowns and variables with startups that I think it's very dependent on the nature of that particular startup.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's, in general, yes, smaller companies are better. But you also run a risk there where you might end up with people that are horrible managers because they were never trained on that. You also generally have smaller data sets that you're playing with. One of the benefits of big companies is you get to do a broader range of work. Now, that said, you could also get stuck in a corner and be doing intern-type work. But yeah, in general, I would say startups, if you can afford it.
Yeah, afford it, and do you have the energy for it, right? Yeah. I feel like there's a curve as to how much energy you have and how small the company you can survive in for how long, right?
All right, well, thank you so much for our panelists. Give it up.
All right, thanks. A round of applause. Great job, folks.